Capua, one of the glorious cities of the Roman Republic. Yet, beneath this glory lay an inhuman brutality. The gladiatorial schools. These schools were dungeons where men, stripped of their freedom, bound by chains, were forged in blood, sweat, and tears. Here, slaves, forced to spend their lives for the entertainment of spectators, faced death every day. Lentulus Batiatus's gladiatorial school was one of the most brutal and well-known in Capua. In narrow, filthy cells, hundreds of men from different backgrounds learned to wield swords, throw spears, and overpower their opponents. Among them were Gauls, Germanic tribesmen, and Thracians. In each of their eyes, one could read the pain of lost freedom and a sense of hopelessness for the future. Brutal training, beginning with the first light of dawn, continued until sunset. Every blow, every fall, either broke them further or fueled the rage within. Among these slaves was a large, strong, and charismatic man from Thrace, Spartacus. He was different from the other gladiators. In his eyes, there was not only rage, but also deep thought and a silent resistance against injustice. Spartacus was born a warrior. He had fought against the Romans in his tribal lands, but was defeated and enslaved. His skill as a gladiator was undeniable, but victories in the arena were meaningless to him. He sought the meaning of freedom, honor, and being human. His leadership potential was also noticed among the other slaves. His words lightened their despair, igniting a spark within them. In the cold and grim atmosphere of the school, Spartacus's closest friends included Crixus, a powerful Gallic gladiator, and Inomus, a disciplined and honorable Germanic slave. Although Crixus was not as deeply thoughtful as Spartacus, he was a loyal warrior and fully trusted Spartacus. Inomus, on the other hand, was more cautious and strategic in his thinking. Together, they supported each other against the brutality, put up of the gladiatorial school, sharing their dreams of freedom. The lives of the gladiators consisted of brutal training, endless lashings, and a complete lack of hope for their future. A visit by a high-ranking Roman official to the school marked a moment when this oppression reached its peak. A spectacle was arranged where gladiators were forced to fight each other. For Spartacus, this spectacle was the final straw. Before his very eyes, his friends were killing each other just for the entertainment of the Romans. The bloody sands of the arena ignited an indescribable rage in his soul. Meanwhile, Lentulus Batiatus, the owner of the school, proudly watched every move of the gladiators, their brutality. For him, these slaves were nothing more than property. In the evening, when the gladiators returned to their cells, a fire of rebellion burned within them. Spartacus looked at them. Their faces showed deep sorrow and anger. "Do you want to be free?" he whispered. This whisper spread like a wind through the cells. At first, there was hesitation, fear, but the determination in Spartacus's eyes gave them courage. In the dark and cold cells of the gladiatorial school, Spartacus and his friends gathered with a faint hope for the future. Spartacus's words, "We will break our chains. We will reclaim our freedom," ignited a spark in the eyes of the others. The chains on the gladiators' hands were not merely a physical barrier, but also a symbol of their despair. Yet tonight, these chains were about to be broken. The plan was simple: to start a rebellion, seize the school, and take the first step towards freedom. The gladiatorial school of Capua would shake the Roman Republic, becoming the birthplace of history's greatest slave revolt. The gladiatorial school in Capua held its breath that night. Whispers circulated among the cold stone walls of the cell's rebellion. Spartacus's words had penetrated the deepest corners of despair, igniting the spark of the quest for freedom. The plan was simple but required courage: to seize the school, break the chains, and escape this bondage. With the first light of dawn, the gladiators were led out to the arena for training as usual. But this time, in their eyes, instead of the usual exhaustion, there was a resolute gleam. Spartacus waited for the right moment. Taking advantage of a moment of chaos, they used whatever they could find as weapons, kitchen utensils, butcher knives, and even wooden benches. Unexpectedly, with Spartacus's cry of freedom, the rebellion began. The school guards were stunned, facing the wrath of trained gladiators. The guards were quickly overpowered. Blood mixed with the arena sands as the gladiators shed their first blood for their freedom. As they advanced towards the outer gates of the school, they encountered their greatest obstacle: armed Roman soldiers. But Spartacus and his companions utilized their fighting skills, honed in the gladiatorial school, far more effectively than expected. Crixus's savage strength, Inamos's strategic moves, and Spartacus's charismatic leadership caught the Roman soldiers off guard. The gladiators seized the guards' swords and armor, further empowering themselves. However, remaining in Capua would be suicide. Rome's power was too great, and the rebellion would quickly be suppressed. Spartacus's vision was larger: to fight for freedom and to break the chains of slavery completely. Approximately 70 to 80 rebels who escaped the gladiatorial school headed out of Capua towards the mountains for safety. Their destination was Mount Vesuvius, near the Bay of Naples. This was a strategic point where they could both hide and strengthen their positions. Upon reaching the foothills of Vesuvius, the gladiators felt reborn. With the morale boost from their first victory, they turned the mountains' challenging terrain to their advantage. They climbed the slopes, using rocky caves and secret passages as shelters. Here they were preparing not just to survive, but to fight and defy Rome. Soon, slaves escaping from surrounding farms and estates began to join the rebels. Spartacus's name spread like a whispered hope among the oppressed. His army was growing rapidly. Rome initially underestimated this gladiator rebellion. To them, It was a simple uprising by a few bandits that could easily be suppressed. The Roman Senate, not taking the matter seriously, sent a small contingent commanded by an inexperienced praetor, Gaius Claudius Glaber. Glaber besieged the rebels at the foot of Mount Vesuvius. He blocked the only known path up the mountain, expecting Spartacus and his men to surrender from hunger and thirst. Glaber's confidence was absolute. He believed the gladiators stood no chance against Roman legionaries. But Spartacus managed to turn his enemy's contempt to his advantage. When Glaber's army blocked the only way to the mountain's summit, the rebels seemed helpless. Yet Spartacus responded with a brilliant tactic. He ordered his men to cut wild vines growing on the mountain slopes and fashion them into ropes. Using these ropes, they descended a steep, sheer cliff that Glaber's army did not expect. As night fell, Glaber's camp became silent. The soldiers, thinking the gladiators were trapped, slept soundly. But Spartacus and his men, taking advantage of the darkness and surprise, attacked Glaber's camp. When the Roman soldiers awoke in shock, they were met with the gladiators' fury. Complete panic quickly ensued. Glaber's forces scattered. Many soldiers were killed or captured. From the summit of Mount Vesuvius, shouts of victory echoed, bearing witness to Rome's first defeat. Spartacus was no longer just an escaped slave, but a leader challenging Rome, fighting for freedom. With the euphoria of victory, Spartacus stood on Vesuvius's summit, the wind sweeping through his hair. His eyes focused on a new horizon, opening to freedom. This was the first sign that a spark underestimated by Rome would turn into a wildfire, and that history's greatest slave revolt was just beginning. Chains had been broken, the first steps taken. Rome had now stopped rubbing its eyes, finally realizing that this slave revolt rising from Capua was a real threat to the Republic. The consecutive defeats of Praetors Verinius and Cassinius had proven that Spartacus's army was not just a handful, piege of gladiators, but a growing and organized force. Rome had to accept this humiliating situation. On its own soil, it was repeatedly defeated by an army of slaves. Spartacus had spent the winter months in his camp, a captured Roman encampment. Despite the cold and harsh conditions, he maintained discipline. He continued to teach his men the fighting techniques they had learned from Rome, and he employed blacksmiths to produce their own weapons and armor. His army now consisted of over 70,000 slaves and poor Romans seeking freedom. This colossal multitude had become a force capable of challenging Rome. However, this growth brought new problems. Spartacus's primary goal was to lead his slaves out of Roman territory and send everyone back to their homelands to live freely. According to him, the sole purpose of this rebellion was to break Rome's chains and never again experience slavery. Therefore, he aimed to advance north towards the Alps and disperse freely from there. But within the army, there were different desires and ambitions. Crixus, in particular, opposed Spartacus's passive plan. Crixus and the Gallic and Germanic slaves under his leadership wanted to directly target Rome, take revenge, and plunder the lands they conquered. For them, freedom meant bringing Rome to its knees. These two differing visions created a tense internal conflict within the rebel army. While Spartacus appreciated Crixus's warrior spirit, he feared that his short-term goals would jeopardize the rebellion's ultimate objectives. These internal tensions became even more pronounced during the winter months. As the army advanced northward, Crixus's men grew increasingly rebellious, uncomfortable with Spartacus's discipline. Some minor uprisings and looting incidents also occurred. Spartacus made great efforts to keep his army together. His leadership began to be questioned. Rome, however, was not idle. When they learned that the rebels were heading north, their panic subsided somewhat. The Roman Senate, acting more cautiously this time, sent an army under the command of one of the consuls, Lucius Gellius Poplicola, against Spartacus. At the same time, when they received intelligence about Crixus's defection, they seized this weakness as an opportunity, dispatching another contingent under Praetor Quintus Arrius to target Crixus. Rome was employing a strategy of dividing and weakening the rebels, then destroying them one by one. Crixus and his contingent of approximately 30,000 men separated from Spartacus and headed south into the Apulia region. They wanted to defy Rome and plunder the rich cities in the area, but this would be their end. Praetor Quintus Arrius's forces caught Crixus's army in Apulia. Numerically and militarily superior Roman legions quickly surrounded Crixus's men. After a bloody battle, Crixus and a large part of his forces were slaughtered. This was a heavy blow to the rebel army and a great loss for Spartacus. In the heart of Rome, panic was felt in the silent corridors of the Senate building. What had been seen as a mere slave revolt had now become a growing force that defeated Rome on its own soil. Spartacus's name was no longer just that of a gladiator, but of one of Rome's greatest enemies. In the bitter cold of winter, Spartacus stood on the ruins of a burning Roman encampment. Around him were thousands of cheering slave soldiers who had won their freedom with their own hands. His eyes looked far away towards the Alps. His aim was not only to defeat Rome, but to promise true freedom to all who broke their chains. But as his army grew, different ideas would also begin to emerge within it. He did not yet know that Rome's greatest generals had not yet appeared on the scene. The slaughter of Crixus by Roman legions in Apulia profoundly shook Spartacus's army. This was not merely a loss, but the bitter consequence of the growing division within the rebels. Spartacus's vision of advancing north to the Alps and dispersing Prili had clashed with Crixus's quest for vengeance against Rome, and this conflict had ended in bloodshed. Spartacus was in deep mourning over the death of his friend and the heavy blow his army had suffered. But this also made him even more resolute to honor Crixus's memory and rekindle the rebels' morale. Spartacus made a brutal and bloody decision. He forced 300 high-rankings, Roman commanders and captured senators to engage in gladiatorial combat. He sought to avenge the gladiatorial games in Capua, where his own friend's blood had been shed. This event was a great insult to Rome and a clear demonstration of Spartacus's rage and determination. As the arena was stained with blood, the slaves once again asserted their dominance over their masters. Following this event, Spartacus reconsidered his northern objectives. He realized that after Crixus's death, it would be even more difficult to lead his entire rebel army to the Alps. Furthermore, the exhaustion created by Rome's power and the endless conflicts also played a role. Spartacus decided to forge a new route to freedom, to move south into Italy, and from there to cross into Sicily. Sicily had been the site of 2 major slave revolts a century earlier. He believed this island could offer hope for escaping Rome and perhaps building a new life. Sicily's natural geography could provide a strong defensive line for the rebels. Despite the loss of Crixus, Spartacus's army was still massive and continued to strike fear into Rome. Their new objective was to advance south towards Rhegium, modern-day Reggio Calabria. However, this decision would not go unnoticed by Rome. In the Roman Senate, the situation was tense. The consecutive defeats and the rebellion spiraling out of control had completely shattered Rome's prestige. Rome's best generals, Pompey and Lucullus, were at that time on campaigns in Spain and the East. This situation forced the Senate into a difficult choice. In desperation, they had to turn to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, but with limited military experience. Crassus was one of Rome's most ambitious and wealthy individuals. Suppressing the slave revolt was not just a duty for him, but a unique opportunity to reach the pinnacle of his political career. Rome would now take this rebellion seriously and respond with all its might. Crassus was granted absolute authority, then given a massive army of 8 legions to suppress the rebellion. Known for his ruthlessness and discipline, Crassus introduced his own methods to his army. In particular, to enforce discipline, he reinstituted the ancient Roman punishment of decimatio, decimation, in his army. This horrific method involved the killing of 1 out of every 10 soldiers by their comrades in front of the others. Crassus aimed to instill fear in his soldiers, make them forget their disdain for the slaves, and ensure absolute obedience. His army was becoming a determined, ruthless force ready to stop Spartacus. The army of Spartacus, advancing towards Sicily, was exhausted but full of hope as they marched along the dusty roads of the south. Spartacus, on his horse, his eyes on the horizon, was dreaming of the island. This time, the former gladiator, underestimated by Rome, was facing one of Rome's wealthiest and most ruthless generals, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Two strong wills were on a collision course. The face of Roman power and ambition had now emerged with all its might against Spartacus's quest for freedom. Near Regium, Crassus's brilliant fortification line had effectively trapped Spartacus and his army in a cage. The path to the north was blocked, and crossing to Sicily was impossible due to the betrayal of the Cilician pirates. The biting cold of winter had further depleted the rebels' already scarce provisions, and hunger and despair spread throughout the army. Crassus's strategy was working: to wear down Spartacus's army and force them to surrender. Even in this desperation, Spartacus maintained his leadership. He tried to boost his men's morale, reminding them that they still had a chance. He tried to keep them together with the promise of striking a final blow against Rome and winning their freedom. However, the situation was becoming increasingly dire. Crassus's legions constantly patrolled along the ditch and wall, preventing even the slightest escape attempt. The rebels felt trapped behind the walls, left to their fate. Crassus, with the relief of knowing Spartacus was trapped, sent news of victory back to Rome. But deep down, he knew he had to hurry. Rome's other great generals, Gnaeus Pompey and Lucius Licinius Lucullus, were on their way back from their campaigns in the East and Spain with victories. Crassus wanted the glory of defeating Spartacus by himself, and had no intention of sharing this fame with anyone. Tease. The news that Pompey's formidable army was approaching Italy only fueled Crassus's ambition. He had to defeat Spartacus before Pompey arrived. Spartacus was aware that the siege had to be broken. In the darkest hours of the night, he sent out scouting parties to identify the weakest point in the massive fortification. In the bitter cold of winter, one night, suddenly, the rebels attacked Crassus's wall. Their aim was to break through the wall and breach the siege. Despite the snow, the biting wind, and their exhaustion, the rebels fought with incredible determination. This battle would be one of the last examples of Spartacus's strategic genius. The rebels filled the enemy's ditches with wood and earth, using crude ladders to climb the walls. Crassus's legionaries were caught unprepared by this unexpected night attack. The clashes were bloody and violent. Both sides suffered heavy losses. Finally, a small portion of Spartacus's rebels, led by him, managed to breach Crassus's fortifications. This was a great victory, but the cost was heavy. Spartacus, leaving, A large part of his army behind had escaped the siege with this last desperate move. However, this escape had made them even more dangerous in Rome's eyes. In a snowy and desolate area, Spartacus and the few loyal soldiers who remained with him advanced, exhausted but free. Crassus's face showed both anger and admiration, although Spartacus's escape infuriated him. He couldn't help but respect the slave leader's military skill. However, Crassus was now more determined than ever to bring about Spartacus's end. Rome's powerful generals were now closing in on Spartacus from all sides. This escape was one of Spartacus's final moves. Freedom had never been so close, yet so far. The small contingent of Spartacus's army that managed to break through Crassus's fortifications continued to advance south, exhausted in the harsh winter conditions. However, the passage to Sicily, which they had seen as the gateway to freedom, was now impossible. The betrayal of the Cilician pirates and the presence of the Roman navy in the region had closed off the sea. Despite Spartacus's determination, despair cast a shadow over the army. Provisions were running out, and cold and disease continued to claim lives. In these desperate circumstances, Spartacus's leadership was more crucial than ever. He had to boost his men's morale to make them believe they still had a chance. He tried to keep them together with the promise of striking a final blow against Rome and winning their freedom. But desperation was causing new divisions among the rebels. Some groups began to separate from Spartacus and act on their own, desperately, seeking ways to survive. In Rome, the return of Pompey and Lucullus increased the pressure on Crassus. Pompey had returned victorious from Spain, advancing into Italy with his army. Lucullus had also returned from his campaign in the east and had directed his army towards Italy. Both generals wanted the glory of defeating Spartacus. Pompey, in particular, sought to further enhance his political prestige under the guise of eliminating the remaining runaway slaves. Crassus saw this situation as an opportunity to solidify his own victory. He had to completely destroy Spartacus before Pompey and Lucullus arrived. Therefore, he meticulously tracked Spartacus's escape route and planned to force him into one last major confrontation. The Roman army was now converging on Spartacus from three separate directions: Crassus's army, Pompey's army, and Lucullus's army. The rebels were completely surrounded. Spartacus was aware of this encirclement. He knew that all of Rome's might was bearing down on them. He led the remainder of his army south into the Lucania region. Here, far from Rome's vast plains, in more mountainous and forested terrain. He hoped to stage a final stand. Perhaps with one last desperate attack, he could defeat one of Rome's generals and open a path. As they followed this final escape route, the rebels were exhausted from fatigue and hunger. Spartacus, on horseback, his eyes on the horizon, tried to devise one last plan. One last defiance against Rome. One last push for freedom. But with every step, the uncertainty of the future grew heavier. The massive Roman legions had cornered Spartacus's army in a mountain pass. Spartacus looked at the soldiers around him. Their faces showed both exhaustion and determination. There was nowhere left to retreat. It was either freedom or death. Spartacus drew his sword and addressed his soldiers one last time. Today, we will either win our freedom or we will die as free men. These words heralded the final major confrontation. Rome's greatest generals were now united, and Spartacus's epic resistance was heading towards a bloody end. At the bloody battle near the Silurus River, Spartacus's revolt was completely crushed. The Roman armies declared their victories, once again subjugating the slaves. But this victory was not merely a relief for Rome. It also left deep scars that would be felt for decades to come. The horrific sight of thousands of crucified slaves lining the Appian Way from Capua to Rome served as a permanent warning, reminding everyone of Rome's power and its terrible cruelty. This was a message not only to the slaves, but also to all dissenting voices within Rome itself. Spartacus's body was never found, which further solidified his legend. The uncertainty surrounding his final moments increased the symbolic power of the rebellion and its leader. Even though Rome tried to erase him from history, Spartacus's name spread among slaves in whispers for generations. He became the hope, both the oppressed, an eternal symbol of resistance against injustice and the pursuit of freedom. The Spartacus revolt further weakened the already shaky foundations of the Roman Republic. This uprising clearly demonstrated the fragility of Rome's slave system and the potential dangers it contained. Given that slavery was the cornerstone of Rome's economy and society, the fear and anxiety generated by this rebellion were immense. While Rome began to treat its slaves more cautiously, a fundamental change in this system would take centuries. One of the greatest consequences of the rebellion was the political rise of generals, like Marcus Licinius Crassus and Gnaeus Pompey. Crassus gained immense military renown by suppressing the revolt, but their rivalry intensified when Pompey claimed the final share of the glory. This rivalry would eventually lead to the political struggles that would include Julius Caesar and ultimately bring about the end of the Roman Republic. The generals beginning to secure Rome's safety with their personal armies would diminish the Senate's power and pave the way for a single-man rule. Spartacus's revolt showed that even slaves could resist against Rome's military discipline and power. This event became a turning point in Roman history and inspired future slave revolts for centuries. Spartacus triggered questions about the nature of the institution of slavery and left a deep wound in Rome's conscience. His story became a universal symbol of resistance against injustice, the pursuit of freedom, and the preservation of hope, even in the darkest moments. Spartacus's revolt was the culmination of a great tragedy and social turmoil in the last days of the Roman Republic. The story of thousands of slaves who risked their lives to break their chains revealed the dark truth beneath Rome's splendor. Spartacus may have fallen in battle, but the spirit of his resistance was indelibly etched into the pages of history. While Rome believed it had saved itself by suppressing this rebellion, its own deep cracks and contradictions became even more apparent. Accelerating the inevitable collapse of the Republic, Spartacus's legacy endured, not just as a slave revolt, but as an immortal epic of human dignity and the quest for freedom.